It was over. Not metaphorically, not strategically. Over. And the men who knew it, the generals, the intelligence officers, the commanders hunched over maps in candlelit rooms, couldn't say it out loud. Because if they did, the whole thing would collapse. The alliance, the strategy, the war itself. In the winter of 1944, a German assault that American intelligence had declared impossible tore open the Western Front like a wound that wouldn't close. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were swallowed by a frozen Belgian forest, cut off from supply lines, from reinforcements, from any reliable sense of what was happening or where the enemy was coming from next. And in the highest offices of Allied command, men who had never once shown fear were quietly, privately, terrified. Here is the question that the victory parades were never designed to answer. How close did America actually come to losing? Not retreating, not regrouping, losing. The kind of loss that rewrites the map of the world, that changes what language your grandchildren speak, that ends the war on terms no American alive in 1944 could have survived knowing were possible. This is the story most documentaries skim past, because the truth is far more unsettling than the mythology of Allied inevitability allows. At History Unlocked, we exist for exactly this moment, for the history that was buried under bronze monuments and rehearsed triumph, for the documents that stayed classified for decades, for the decisions made in freezing darkness that the official record was never meant to fully explain. If you believe that the real story of history, unfiltered, uncomfortable, and completely honest, is the only story worth telling, then what you're about to hear was made for you. Stay with us, because what happened in December of 1944 has never been told with the full weight it deserves. By the autumn of that year, America was winning. Everyone believed it, the soldiers in the field, the journalists filing dispatches from liberated Paris, the generals at Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles. Allied forces had swept across France at breathtaking speed. The Wehrmacht was invisible. Measurable retreat. General George Patton, a man constitutionally incapable of understatement, was publicly promising that American armor could reach Berlin by Christmas. And people believed him, because the evidence seemed to support exactly that conclusion. Allied intelligence, the most sophisticated military analysis apparatus in the world, the machine that had broken German codes and tracked enemy movements with remarkable precision, delivered a formal assessment that autumn. The German military, they declared, was spent. The exact phrase used in official reports, no longer capable of sustained offensive operations. Read that again. No longer capable of sustained offensive operations. 7 weeks later, one of the largest military offensives in the history of warfare erupted from those same German forces, aimed directly at the thinnest, most vulnerable section of the entire American line. The analysts weren't incompetent. That's what makes this so dangerous to understand. They had tracked German withdrawals correctly. They had measured fuel shortages. They had counted the destroyed tanks and cataloged the prisoner numbers. The data was real, but data doesn't lie. Interpretation does. What no one in a position of power was truly willing to consider was Adolf Hitler's willingness to sacrifice everything, every reserve, every veteran unit, every remaining strategic resource for a single, catastrophic gamble. Not to win the war outright, to shatter the Allied coalition, to create enough chaos and enough loss that America and Britain might, just might, come to the negotiating table. The plan carried a code name: Watch on Rhine, Watch on the Rhine. And in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 1944, it exploded out of the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes is not where you expect a modern army to move. Dense, hilly. The roads are narrow even in summer. In December, with ice on every surface and temperatures falling below zero, classical military doctrine considered offensive movement through that terrain essentially impossible, which is precisely why the American line there was thin. 83 miles of front, held by roughly 83,000 men, green troops seeing combat for the first time, alongside exhausted divisions pulled back for rest and recovery. The assumption that had governed this deployment was absolute. The Germans would not come through here. They couldn't. At 5:30 in the morning, approximately 200,000 German soldiers, 600 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along that entire line. The American soldiers who survived the first hours described it in letters home and in after-action reports with a consistency that historians have noted for decades. They didn't describe fear first. They described something stranger and more destabilizing than fear. Incomprehension. The war was almost over. Everyone had said so. And yet here, in a dark Belgian forest, the world was disintegrating around them. Within hours, entire units had ceased to exist as functioning military forces. Communication lines were cut. Commanders couldn't reach their battalions. Battalions dissolved into companies. Companies into isolated clusters of men, each fighting a private, terrifying, separate war in the snow. The 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions, had been on the line for 5 days. 5 days! Many of its soldiers had never fired a weapon in combat. 2 of the division's 3 regiments, approximately 8,000 men, were surrounded, cut off, and ultimately forced to surrender. It remains one of the largest mass surrenders of American forces in the entire war. 8,000 men, in 5 days. Ask yourself what that feels like. 20 years old, dark, snow, a foreign forest, German soldiers closing the circle. What do you do? What do you think about? Do you fight? Do you run? Do you sit down in the frozen mud and try to remember what home sounds like? History asks these questions not for drama. It asks them because the answer is the war. The real war. The one beneath the maps and the arrows and the numbers. 2 days into the assault, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower still did not fully understand what he was facing. This is one of history's most uncomfortable admissions. The man coordinating the largest Western military alliance ever assembled, a man of extraordinary intelligence and legendary composure, was receiving fragmentary, contradictory, and in some cases flatly wrong information about the scale of what had been unleashed. The communication infrastructure that commanders relied on had been partially destroyed in the first hours of the assault. Reports were delayed, corrupted, or simply absent. Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun, the same French town where, in the First World War, 700,000 men had died in a single sustained battle. The symbolism was not lost on the men in that room. Neither was the atmosphere. By multiple first-hand accounts, what settled over the conference table was not the visible, loud panic of frightened men. It was something far more dangerous, the cold, silent kind. The kind where professionals who have spent entire careers projecting certainty suddenly cannot quite hold eye contact. Eisenhower's chief of intelligence had to stand before those assembled commanders and say something no intelligence officer ever wants to say. We missed it. Not a small miss. Not an underestimation at the margins. A catastrophic, foundational failure. The largest German offensive since 1940 had launched, and the people responsible for preventing surprises had been completely, entirely surprised. Eisenhower looked around the table and made a deliberate choice. He reportedly opened the formal discussion by saying, "The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us, and not a disaster." The room was silent. Then Patton laughed. A real laugh, because Patton had already begun planning the counterattack in his mind before the conference had even started. But there was something Eisenhower had not disclosed. Something he would not raise at Verdun. Something that, had it reached the American public in those first days of the German offensive, might have fractured the civilian will to continue the war entirely. That revelation would surface later, and when it does, the battle takes on a completely different dimension. Because in the field, the situation was deteriorating faster than any map in Versailles could reflect. The German spearhead was not just breaking through, it was racing. SS battle groups were moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned even experienced American defenders. And in the village of Malmedy, one of those battle groups committed an act that would transform the entire emotional character of the battle. 84 American prisoners of war, unarmed, standing in an open, snow-covered field, shot, left where they fell. The Malmedy massacre moved through the American military like a current. Men who had been retreating stopped retreating. Something shifted from military crisis to something personal. Something that doesn't respond to calculation. But hardened men still need ammunition, still need fuel, still need someone at the top who knows what is happening. And in a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne, an American force was about to discover what happens when all three of those things disappear at once. Bastogne was a convergence point. 7 major roads met there. In winter warfare, across forested and hilly terrain with few viable routes for armor, that made it one of the most strategically critical positions in the entire theater. Both sides grasped this simultaneously. The Germans needed it to channel their armor westward toward the Meuse River and ultimately toward the port of Antwerp, the capture of which was the entire strategic purpose of the offensive. Antwerp's fall meant the Allied supply chains collapse. The supply chains collapse meant the war in the West entered a fundamentally different phase, one that no Allied planner had modeled or prepared for. Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, to hold it. There is a particular irony in that decision that history has not always paused to examine. The 101st had just come off Operation Market Garden in Holland, the brutal September airborne assault that had ended in strategic failure and devastating casualties. The division had been pulled back to France to recover. Men were still bandaged. When the orders came, they loaded onto trucks in the freezing night without adequate winter clothing, without full ammunition stores, without any reliable picture of what they were driving toward. One veteran, speaking decades later, put it this way: we didn't know where we were going. We just knew it was bad. You could feel it in the way the officers weren't talking. By the time the 101st reached Bastogne, the German encirclement was almost complete. Then it was complete. 18,000 men, surrounded by multiple German divisions. No air support, the weather had closed in completely. A solid gray ceiling that grounded every Allied aircraft in the theater. No resupply, no reinforcements on the way. Ammunition was being rationed by the shell. Men were cutting apart their own uniform linings to wrap around their feet because they had no winter boots. The temperature fell to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. On December 22nd, a German officer arrived at the American perimeter under a white flag. He carried a written surrender demand. Formal, dignified, precisely military in its language. The Americans were given 2 hours. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read the document, looked up at his staff, and then wrote a reply that traveled across the Allied world like an electrical charge. One word: nuts! The German officer reportedly required a translation. What it meant, in the bluntest American terms available: we will not surrender. Come and take us. That single word reached the press, then the public. And something shifted in the broader war, a psychological current that ran deeper than any tactical map could measure. But here is where the legend and the truth must be carefully separated, because while McAuliffe was writing that reply, his men were dying, quietly, in foxholes, from frostbite, from artillery, from infections that couldn't be treated because the medical supplies were exhausted, from the particular psychological torment of knowing that beyond every tree line in every direction, there were German soldiers waiting for the Americans to break. How do you not break? Survivor testimony returns to this question relentlessly, and the answers are never simple. It was never ideology alone. It was the man in the hole beside you. It was the refusal to be the one who quit. It was a kind of fury at the cold, at the impossibility of the situation, at the simple indignity of dying in a Belgian forest. One sergeant who survived Bastogne described it as just refusing to think past the next 5 minutes. Now comes what this story has been building toward, and it requires sitting with something uncomfortable. There is a document in the National Archives that most Americans have never encountered, written during the Battle of the Bulge, addressed to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall in Washington, originating from Eisenhower's own headquarters, declassified decades after the war ended. It contains a formal, clinical assessment, stripped of all emotion, professional to its core, of what would happen if the German offensive successfully reached the Meuse River. The conclusion: Allied forces would likely be unable to prevent a strategic withdrawal to defensive positions along the Seine. The coalition would face a fundamental reassessment of the viability of a cross-channel strategy. In plain language, if the Germans broke through, the entire Allied plan for defeating Nazi Germany from the West might have to be abandoned. American and British forces would retreat. Pressure on Germany's eastern front would ease, and Germany might hold for months, perhaps considerably longer. This is what Eisenhower had not disclosed at Verdun. This is what could not be allowed to surface publicly. And in those additional months, this is the part the documents only imply. but that historians have since stated directly Hitler would have continued operating the extermination programs running at full capacity in the East. The death camps, still receiving trains, still processing their horrifying arithmetic. The frozen soldiers of Bastogne were not simply fighting to hold a crossroads town. They were, without knowing it, holding a thread connected to millions of lives they would never meet and never know existed. History records individual courage beautifully. It struggles with this kind of vast, silent, terrible arithmetic. This is why the work of telling history honestly, without softening it, without shaping it toward comfortable conclusions, is not just interesting. It is necessary. At History Unlocked, this is the commitment. The stories buried in classified archives and survivor testimony and the footnotes that official history preferred to leave unread. If you understand why that work matters, you already know why this channel exists and why it cannot be optional for people who take history seriously. Now, back to Patton. Back to what he was laughing about at Verdun. When Eisenhower asked his commanders how quickly a relief force could be turned and driven south toward Bastogne, the room hesitated. Moving a large armored force in winter, pivoting at 90 degrees, relocating it across icy roads, in darkness, without air cover, was not considered a rapid option by any reasonable military calculus. The consensus leaned toward 2 weeks, perhaps 10 days under ideal conditions. Patton said 48 hours. The room did not immediately believe him. Eisenhower pressed, and Patton, who had already, quietly, ordered his staff to begin preliminary planning for exactly this maneuver before the Verdun conference convened. Before Eisenhower had even formulated the question, confirmed it. He had 3 separate operational plans prepared. He simply needed to know which one to execute. When can you move? Eisenhower asked. As soon as you're through with me, Patton said. What happened next is studied in military academies to this day. Third Army pivoted. In ice. In darkness. In radio silence. 250,000 men. Hundreds of tanks. Hundreds of thousands of tons of equipment turned 90 degrees in 48 hours and began driving north toward Bastogne. The logistical achievement alone is staggering, but the legend tends to obscure what it cost. The drive north was brutal. Third Army ran into fierce German resistance almost immediately. The terrain punished every mile. The weather remained catastrophic, the cloud ceiling held low, keeping Allied air power grounded at the moment it was most desperately needed. Patton's columns advanced slowly, painfully, at enormous human cost. And inside Bastogne, the last reserves of everything were running out. Morphine, surgical supplies, artillery shells counted and rationed individually. On December 23rd, a rare break in the overcast allowed Allied transport aircraft to reach the perimeter, but the drop was partial. Supplies drifted into German lines. The attacks on Bastogne intensified through Christmas Eve. The fiercest assaults of the entire siege came on the night most of those men would have given anything to be somewhere else on Earth. On December 26th, 10 days after the German assault began, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division punched through the German lines south of Bastogne. The corridor that opened was less than a quarter-mile wide, but it was open. The siege was broken. The 101st Airborne had held. What followed is where myth and reality diverge most dangerously. The battle did not end. The full Battle of the Bulge continued until January 25th, 1945, 40 more days of grinding. Attritional winter combat. The bulge in the Allied line remained vast, and closing it cost weeks and enormous casualties. Frostbite cases numbered in the tens of thousands. Men lost toes and feet and fingers in the cold. And a second crisis, the one Eisenhower had withheld at Verdun, now made itself impossible to ignore any longer. The Allied armies were running out of infantry replacements. The brutal pace of the fall campaign had consumed divisions faster than the training pipeline from American bases could replenish them. Eisenhower made a decision that was, for its time, extraordinary. He ordered the integration of African American soldiers as individual replacements into previously all-white infantry units. In the middle of a battle, in direct violation of official Army segregation policy, approximately 4,500 black soldiers volunteered for combat infantry duty, accepting reductions in rank to fill the available slots. They fought in the Bulge. They fought well. Their white comrades, in the accounts historians have since gathered from both sides, reported overwhelmingly that the integration worked. The Army buried those reports after the war. Formal military desegregation did not come until Truman's executive order in 1948. Men who proved, under fire, in the worst winter battle of the entire Western theater, that the law was wrong were then required to return to a country that continued to operate as though they hadn't. The institution that needed their lives declined to acknowledge what their lives had proven. At History Unlocked, this is precisely the kind of truth that cannot be permitted to remain buried. We began with a question. How close did America actually come to losing? Here is the honest answer. The German strategic objective reaching Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies, forcing a negotiated peace was, in retrospect, almost certainly beyond what their logistics could have sustained even under favorable circumstances. Military historians today generally hold that conclusion, but retrospect is a luxury that none of the men in that forest possessed. Eisenhower didn't have it. The analysts in Washington didn't have it. The soldiers in the foxholes certainly didn't have it. What they had was this. Within days of the German assault, multiple American divisions had been shattered. A gap 60 miles wide and 30 miles deep had opened in the Allied line, and more than 75,000 American casualties had been taken in 6 weeks more than the United States suffered across the entire Pacific theater in the same period. And the deeper question, the one military historians have debated for 8 decades, is this: what if the weather had held for 2 more weeks? If that cloud ceiling had not broken, if Allied air power had remained grounded, the mathematics of attrition become genuinely uncertain. Patton was advancing, but slowly. The German grip on the Bastogne corridor was strengthening by the day. Without air support to hammer German columns and supply lines, the outcome ceases to be inevitable. 2 weeks of weather. That is the thread. Not genius. Not strategy. Not leadership. A cloud ceiling. The most powerful military alliance in human history came within 2 weeks of sustained overcast sky from entering a fundamentally different war. If that does not unsettle you, it is because you have not yet sat with it long enough. There is a military cemetery near the Belgian town of Henri-Chapelle. More than 7,000 American servicemen are buried there. White crosses in rows that seem to extend past any reasonable horizon. Each stone marks a man who had a name, a family, and a future that stopped in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. Some of them never understood what was happening to them. Some of them held for days in conditions that should have broken anyone. Some of them simply served where they were sent, did what was asked, and died in a cold forest in a country most of them had never heard of 2 years earlier. 80 years on, the cemetery is still there. The communities around it still honor what happened. Local Belgian families, men and women who were children during the liberation, still tend the graves of strangers, still bring flowers, still remember. They have not forgotten. So the question worth carrying out of this story, the one that lingers after the facts settle, is this: if the people who were liberated can hold this memory with such fierce tenderness across 8 decades, what do we owe it ourselves? We who inherited the world those men made possible, without ever being asked to pay the price they paid? There is no comfortable answer to that. Only the weight of knowing. Only the responsibility that comes with understanding how close it all came to going the other way, and choosing to hold that knowledge rather than trade it for the easier story. The soldiers of the Ardennes did not fight so their sacrifice could be softened into legend. They fought in cold and darkness and terror, and they held. The world they held it for is the world we are living in right now. History Unlocked exists to witness that truth, not to celebrate it, not to simplify it, but to look at it directly and refuse to look away. Because history is not a story about how things were always going to turn out fine. It is a story about how they almost didn't. And every generation that forgets that will eventually be asked to learn it again.